Like with all great leaders, Napoleon loved reading, sometimes reading so many books to the point where he would starve, preferring to spend his money on books rather than food. He was obsessed with the great literature of ancient Greece and Rome, and if he wasn't happy with the book he was reading, he would simply just throw it into the fire. His childhood friend Bourienne said as a boy Napoleon loved reading about the great men of history, and knew military glory was the only way to cement his place in history, never to be forgotten. So let's start off with his youth. One of Napoleon's favourites as a young boy was one of the highest selling books of the 18th century, Les Nouvelles Heloise by Rousseau, a love story which he claimed to have read at 9 years old, despite it being over 800 pages long. According to Bourienne, during lunchtime at Bourienne Academy, which they attended from age 10 to 15, Napoleon would avoid socialising with the other students and go to the library by himself to read history, particularly enjoying ancient Greek historians such as Polybius, Plutarch, and Arrian. In his later teenage years, Napoleon attended Valence and Auxonne military academies, where he read about the Athenians, the Spartans, Persians, Egyptians, Carthaginians, Achilles, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar. He also read dramas by Corneille, Molière, Racine, and Voltaire, who go on to become one of his all-time favourite writers, as well as Plato's Republic, Marigny's History of the Arabs, Houssaye's History of the Government of Venice, Barrow's History of England, Montesquieu's Spirit of Law, and A History of the Two Indies by Raynal, clocking in at over 1 million words. In fact, Napoleon once called himself a willing disciple of Raynal. And, of course, Machiavelli's The Prince, a book which surely needs no introduction. Written in the 1500s, it's become one of the most famous books of all time, and has become a stereotype for any aspiring leader to read. Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat who wrote on the best way for a ruler to secure power, and says a ruler can only be successful through pragmatic ruthlessness, famously asking, is it better to be feared or loved? Napoleon loved The Prince and studied it with pencil in hand. In fact, a hand-noted copy of his is found in his carriage at Waterloo. Napoleon would constantly make notes and annotations on the books he was reading. From age 17 to 22, Napoleon read and made detailed notes on The History of Florence by Machiavelli, Ancient History by Charles Rollin, Critical History of the Nobility by Jacques Dallaire, Secret Memoirs of the Reigns of Louis XIV and XV by Charles Duclos, and Essays on Morals by Voltaire. Later in life, he said until he was 16, he, quote, would have fought for Rousseau against the friends of Voltaire. Today it is the opposite. The more I read Voltaire, the more I love him. He's a man always reasonable, never a charlatan, never a fanatic. Another one of Napoleon's favourites was Ossian by Scottish poet James Macpherson. Although published in the 1760s, it was based on Irish mythology from the 12th century. The book went on to become an international hit in the late 1700s. Napoleon loved the book so much that he had a painting based on Ossian done on the ceiling above his bed in Rome in 1813. He also attended the premiere of an opera based on Ossian in 1804 by Le Sœur, who dedicated it to him. Napoleon was so thrilled at the opera that he sent Le Sœur the Legion of Honour, the highest award given in France. He memorised entire pages of Caesar's Gallic Wars. He also memorised verses of Corneille, Racine, and Voltaire off by heart, perhaps to charm a pretty girl called Caroline de Colombière. Napoleon was a very romantic man who felt intense love throughout his life. Not only did he write a love story himself, Clisson and Eugene, but another one of his all-time favourite books was a classic love story of the 18th century, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, about a young man dealing with extreme unrequited love for his friend Charlotte, a married girl who doesn't want to be with him. At first she only wants to remain friends, but eventually, due to Werther's love becoming too intense for her, she tells Werther to stop visiting. Eventually his obsession for Charlotte becomes too unbearable, and he's driven to put a gun to his head and pull the trigger. And Charlotte doesn't even go to his funeral. This remained one of Napoleon's favourite novels throughout his entire life. He told Goethe himself in 1808 that he read it on the Egyptian campaign no less than 6 times. Back in Bourienne Military Academy, he also read Roman philosopher Cicero, French philosopher Diderot, Dutch Christian theologian Erasmus, Roman historian Livy, Roman historian Eutropius, ancient Athenian Phaedrus, Roman historian Sallust, Roman poet Virgil, and Lives of Eminent Commanders by Cornelius Nepos, a book on some of the great leaders of the ancient world, such as Athenian leaders Alcibiades and Themistocles, Spartan leaders Lysander, and Hannibal, one of Rome's greatest ever foes, further showing Napoleon's fascination with the great men of ancient history. For example, another one of Napoleon's all-time favourites was The Parallel Lives of the Noble Greek and Romans by Roman historian Plutarch, written in the 2nd century AD, about the great Roman and Greek leaders of the ancient world, from Pericles to Pompey and from Alexander to Caesar. Plutarch writes 46 biographies of the great Roman and Greek leaders, 23 Roman and 23 Greek, and compares them side by side. Napoleon was noted by many people to have loved this book, which makes sense considering Alexander and Caesar were two of his personal heroes, and this book is one of the oldest sources we have on Alexander. Bourienne was a childhood friend of Napoleon's and later his secretary. They first met at Bourienne Military Academy at 80 years old and remained close friends until they had a falling out when they were 33. In his book Memoirs of Napoleon Bonaparte, Bourienne said Napoleon gave him a list of the books he wanted to take with him to Egypt in 1798. Napoleon's shopping list includes Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, Captain Cook's Voyages, La Harpe's Travels, Essay on the Manners of Nations, The Sorrows of Young Werther, The Spirit of Law, The Henriade, the Koran, the Vedas, and the Bible. Also books on Villars, President Hanal, Turenne, Condé, Eugene of Savoy, Charles XII of Sweden, Bertrand de Guesclin, Marshal de Belle Isle, Peter the Great, Marshals of France, The Philosophical History of India, Germany, and Luxembourg. Also books by French writer Voltaire, Greek historian Plutarch, French philosopher Heloise, Greek historian Arrian, Roman historian Tacitus, Roman poet Virgil, Greek historian Thucydides, French playwright Lesage, French historian Werther, Greek philosopher Polybius, Italian historian Danina, French priest Prévost, Roman historian Livy, French historian Marmontel, French poet La Fontaine, French historian and philosopher Montesquieu, Roman historian Justin, Italian poet Ariosto, and Homer. Another one of Napoleon's all-time favourites was Homer's Odyssey, an ancient Greek classic dating back over 2,700 years ago, about a warrior called Odysseus and his 10-year journey to get back home after the Trojan War. Again, this is another example of Napoleon's love for ancient Greece and her literature. Lacoste was a French writer who lived with Napoleon on St. Helena for a year and a half. According to Lacoste in his book Memoirs of the Life, Exile and Conversations of the Emperor Napoleon, while at St. Helena in his twilight years, Napoleon read 1001 Nights, The Vigils of the Castle, The Distracted, The Lawyer Petelin, History of the Crusades, Travels in Switzerland, The Memoirs of Besenval, Tartuffe, The Koran, The Bible, Statistical Surveys of France, Homer's Odyssey, Books on the Nile, Don Quixote, Iphigenia, Encyclopaedia Britannica, and Marmontel's Tales. And Lacoste recalls one night he walked into Napoleon's bedroom to find him sitting by the fire reading Wars of Italy by Servan. Napoleon also liked to read to those around him. Usually after dinner he would read out loud to his guests. Lacoste gives a few instances of Napoleon reading Memoirs of Marshal de Villars, The Death of Pompey, The Guilty Mother, Melanie of La Harpe, Atreus and Thyestes, Comedy of the Plaideurs, Britannicus, and a book on the Battle of Jena, a battle which Napoleon himself led and won against Prussia. Napoleon was clearly inspired and motivated by so many classics of the ancient world, and knew military glory would make his legacy immortal, like Caesar and Alexander. And it's safe to say that it worked. Napoleon has earned his spot in history as one of the greatest men who's ever lived.